So, data-driven SEO is next. So for many, SEO is the black box that doesn't open up easily. It doesn't share with stakeholders easily, prioritize and understand the value to the business that easily either. This session will share with you the tactics and how to equate both overall SEO strategy and individual SEO tactics to business value. So a little bit more of a deep dive into SEO, which is fantastic. With a decade of experience in digital marketing, working across the United States and Australia, our next presenter works in the juncture of SEO, data, CRO, and also user experience. Please welcome to the stage the SEO specialist from Optus, Amanda King.
Can everyone hear me all right? Yes, maybe? So to start off with an initial fact about myself, I am American. I am also an Australian citizen, just received that in October, so yay. Thank you. But like we said, what I really want to get to here is data-driven website decisions. And it's one of those things where it can be a massive boon to your company to really understand what's going on. So what I really want to do is talk about the context in terms of organic SEO and your website, as well as what Google looks for, how we can measure it, how we can improve, testing in frameworks, and then a little bit about myself at the end. So just I'm going to throw a couple of numbers at you. 75% of users never scroll past the first page. We know this, we do it ourselves, but it's always a good thing to remember whether that's an ad or whether that's an organic search result. People don't go past the first page. So if you're not there, then you really aren't there in the consumer's mind and their consideration set. So you really need to figure out ways to get on that first page. And from a mobile search, from a mobile device, 40% of those searches result in organic clicks, while only 2% actually result from a paid click. And then the majority of them don't actually do anything at all, whether that's taking a look at the answer box or having a voice search result. It's really not something, this behavior, we do it ourselves as well, right? And just from a monetary perspective, in 2018, Australians spent nearly $30 billion online. That's massive. And if we're not on the first page, it's really something that can impact the way that our business functions online. So we really want to do everything that we can to get the relevant data to make decisions for that first page and so that we can be there. Now, about 50% of all website traffic comes from organic search. So whether or not you're in the paid space and whether or not that's where most of your revenue comes from at the moment, organic search is still really important for your business and for how you function. And how many of you have heard that Google is just about links and content? Links and content? It's a pretty common mantra that's been around, though it has been changed over the past couple of years. It's also about site speed, right? Again, this is something that we all do. We know we have an attention span of 1.7 seconds. If that 1.7 seconds is spent loading the page, even longer than that, are we actually going to stay? Probably not. It's not a great experience, and Google is able to actually feed that into their algorithm and use it to rank their pages. It has officially, as of 2018, become a explicit ranking factor that Google looks at when they're ranking your site organically. So it's something where you definitely want to pay attention to your speed. And as James said this morning, not just your homepage, but your entire site as well really impacts your visibility. It's about user experience. We all have those websites that we go to that remind us of the 1990s, right? Where it's the scrolling rainbow marquees and the images that are too big, or like this elevator, which makes absolutely no sense, right? So Google is actually able to identify how easy a page is to use. And all other things being equal, they've said they'll rank the one that has a better experience higher. It's logical, it makes sense, but it's not something that we always put into practice. And trust. Trust is a big thing as well, and it's something that, while there may be explicit signals that Google looks at from a metrics perspective, this is where they look at their human raters to actually judge whether or not they feel like a brand and a website is trustworthy. They look at EAT, is what they call it, which is expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness. And I believe it was 2016 now that Google actually leaked their raters guidelines. It's about 200 pages. So if you ever feel like a Sunday evening read to put you to sleep, it might be a good thing to take a look at. But take a Google of it. I'm sure it still exists online in a bunch of different locations if you're interested in reading the full suite of how Google wants their human raters to actually look at websites and understand them. Especially if you're looking at the user experience of your own website, it could be a useful read. Generally, though, it comes down to 6 core concepts. That's mobile first, speed, structured data, content, authority, and integrated search. And these are things that you can apply across all of your channels as well. It's not something that is limited to organic, at least for about 2/3 of the concepts. So with mobile first, you'll want to check Google Search Console for any mobile-friendly warnings. And this is also something where you'll want to take that into account when you're designing. I know for Optus, our general split is about 60% of people come to our website on mobile and about 40% come on desktop, and that's generally pretty standard across Australia. So again, mobile, we want to kind of identify that first and really use that journey. Page speed. Google Analytics does have a report that's on your average page speed, but the way that it's pulled is really only best for at an aggregated site level, because the way that it pulls at the moment is it is a sample of your Chrome users. So it's only about 1% of your Chrome users that actually pulls into that site speed report. So if you really want to get a sense of how your page is doing in terms of site speed, you'd want to use tools like PageSpeed Insights or webpagetest.org. With webpagetest.org, you can actually use servers in Australia, whereas with Google PageSpeed Insights, they usually default to the United States. So you'll have a bit of a lag time in your reporting. With structured data, again, as kind of James mentioned this morning and we've talked about with search engines, structured data is actually really important for voice search and also for getting visibility in that kind of answer box that you see pop up in a lot of searches these days, is getting that structured data as well as the way that you semantically write your code so that you're using the proper tagging for things. In terms of content and authority, I generally default to measuring them through organic traffic, lead generation, and purchases. These are the ones that I usually will look most directly at in terms of the impact to my business. And with integrated search, this is referring to making sure that there's video, images, that it's accessible, and that it's inclusive. So this is, the integrated search is more of another kind of channel that you wanted to take into consideration than necessarily something that is very explicit. And most of these core concepts, Google's actually made really easy to measure, confirm, or implement, but it's really about prioritization and what we want to tackle first, because the way that I tend to describe Google and the way that Google sees websites, it's like a toddler on a sugar rush. You really only have a limited amount of attention span from Google and their robot before they run away and give up. So if your site structure or your URL structure is too confusing, it will go down a bunch of rabbit holes and say, screw this, I'm not coming back, it doesn't make any sense. Or same kind of thing happens if your site takes a long time to load, or if you're using a lot of JavaScript on your page that's making it difficult for Google to actually see what's on the page. So it's really about understanding what is making Google run away. And I do that through a combination of qualitative and quantitative data. Typically, I start with the qualitative. So I start with the user because I recognize that we have our own biases. And if I go into the data and I'm looking for a particular piece of information, my brain will find a way to find it because I'm trying to confirm what I already have in my head. So I'll actually start with the user, and I'll look at user surveys, I'll look at heat mapping, I'll look at customer service feedback. Actually, at one of my old positions, I sat right next to the customer service team, and it was really, really valuable because not only could I talk to them, but I could also hear the conversations that they were having. So I could hear, oh yeah, customers always have questions about how do I reset my password, or what is this fee and what's that fee and how does this work? So it's customer service, I think, is one of the most underutilized resources in your business. It can be. And if you're using your customer service team, great, that's awesome. But if you're not, it's definitely a way to take it into consideration. And NPS, as we've already mentioned, really good explicit feedback from the customer directly. And personas. I am one of the huge advocates for personas and making sure that they are fed into your marketing strategies, especially for things like this, where it really is about putting yourself in the shoes of the customer, because 8 times out of 10, what the customer wants is the same thing that Google wants, and the same kind of things that Google will look for in a really strong website. In terms of tools, is there anyone using Hotjar at the moment? Yeah, a couple hands. This is a really fun tool, especially if you're starting off looking into heat mapping and user experiences on your website. Basically, you'll be able to see how customers interact on any given page. It starts off free, but it does have limitations around the number of pages that you can use. And you would need to manually go through user recordings if you wanted to find trends. Full Story is a little bit different. It's also an aggregation tool, but it actually aggregates the insights and it has algorithms behind it. So if it's seeing trends in terms of, a lot of people are getting really angry at this point, or a lot of people are clicking on this element and it's not actually clickable, they'll pull that all together for you. So if you've got a large website or if you don't have a lot of time, it's worth looking into something like Full Story because it will do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. And then there's also usertesting.com. If you're not able to get your own customers in, or if you're not able to get external testers, doing usertesting.com is a great way to get started. You would want to sit down and have a framework around the kind of journey that you'd want them to go on, that you'd want them to test, whether that was your purchase journey or whatever flow that may be. Obviously, you'd want to make sure that they had a hard goal, something that they really wanted to make sure was being done correctly. And I'm not going to dwell too much on this because we've already talked about it through a couple of different ways this summit. But one data source that if you haven't turned it on already, if you have Google Analytics, or Adobe Analytics may have something similar, but I haven't been in Adobe Analytics in years. But I know Google Analytics does also have explicit first-party demographic data. So if you're looking for a starting place for your converting customers and what those customers look like, Google Analytics is a great place to get started. Now, in terms of, So I worked in e-commerce for a number of years, worked with a lot of different e-commerce companies. A lot of my clients would be jumping for joy if they had a 3.5–4% conversion rate. This is in the kind of the retail space. The question is, do you know what the other 97% of your website users are doing? Sometimes not, right? Sometimes you don't necessarily have a sense of what your customers are doing outside of the kind of big conversions on your website. And that's where the quantitative data comes in terms of helping you make decisions, micro conversions. So whether this would be newsletter signups, contact form submissions, lead generation, downloading a white paper, or even reading a full article. It really depends on what the purpose of your business is and what you're trying to accomplish, but everyone has those kind of secondary conversions that you can track on your website as goals. And beyond this, do you know what they're worth? If a person signs up to your newsletter, how likely are they to actually convert? Does it change their likelihood? Does it change their purchase cart? So those are all things that getting this baseline can really help with. And if you don't know, so say, for example, your average cart value, let's say, is $100, and you have 5 other micro conversions that you want to start tracking, and your newsletter sign-up is what you think will be the most important, assign it a relative value. Say it's worth $50, say it's worth $25, and then cascade down from there. Because what that does, assigning a goal value in Google Analytics, what it actually does is it unlocks, I don't know whether actually I can use this. What it unlocks is the page value metric in Google Analytics. And this is particularly valuable when you're looking at your overall page views, because it will tell you whether or not a page was worth relatively more or relatively less on a person's path to conversion. So if, for some reason, a lot of people who went to, say, your insurance page ended up having a higher conversion, you'd really only be able to know it in an instance like this if you had this data set up. And these, as I said, these really apply to all channels. This is not SEO specific. This is for your website. And these are metrics that will really help you make decisions about what your website is doing and what you need to focus on. Once you have that data, you want to use it to really create benchmarks and determine multipliers to conversion. And what I mean by multipliers to conversion is what I was talking about. That is, if there are particular pages on your website that actually will inordinately increase a person's propensity to convert. And if you're looking for a bit more detail on multipliers to conversion and what I mean by that, one of my favorite marketers is a man by the name of Ian Laurie, and he wrote this massive guide on digital marketing strategy and talks about multipliers to conversion in there. It's a really great read. I highly recommend it. And once you have all of these benchmarks, you can use these to prioritize your on-site improvements. So for me, I start with technology. I start with, can Google actually read your content properly? So for example, that it's not Flash. If anyone had any websites built in Flash, I apologize. That was a very interesting time in technology in the 90s. But hopefully we've gone away from that. But what Flash actually is these days is a lot of JavaScript frameworks. So if you have like Angular or React or any of that on your website, it's worth confirming that the way that you're building your website is a way that Google can actually read it and can actually see it. And there are a lot of guides. Google actually just put one out a couple of months ago on JavaScript SEO. And is your website fast enough? This is a really simple visual that Google had from a data piece that they did a couple of years ago in terms of the probability to bounce. So in terms of justifying to your stakeholders, hey, we need to speed up our website, this is a really easy piece of data to backwards engineer from and say, hey, if our website was 2 seconds faster and we were at that 3-second mark, we'd get X number more customers, and that those customers would convert by X%. So it's something like this where you're able to really kind of backwards engineer to say, yep, okay, speed, it's something that we need to do and something that we need to prioritize. And mobile friendliness as well. I also tend to really look at personas and mapping keywords to personas because it helps really focus your content and make sure that you are doing the non-sexy thing and answering their question, right? Because what it's really all about is that we are answering the question of the customer. And it's not sexy and it's not fun. And I'm unfortunately the bearer to say that SEO isn't always very fun, but you do need to make sure that you are answering the consumer's question. So having personas and mapping that to keyword research can really help clarify for you the questions that customers are asking in their searches and making sure that those are being answered in a way that makes sense. And while also making sense to Google by using the schema that we mentioned earlier as well. So typically, my hit list is I make sure that it's able to read the site, that it's mobile friendly and fast, that the content is authoritative, that you've got technical enhancements in terms of unstructured data, and then any other formats. So if you want to have a video or if you have images, that those are included as well. So you've got all this data. Now what do you do with it? A/B test, right? We hypothesize that by doing X, we will increase Y by Z. This is my format. This is where I live when it comes to creating optimizations. I always want to make sure that there is a target and that it is clear what impact I think this is going to have, because then you can go to your bosses, to your stakeholders and say, look, this is what I think is going to happen, and this is why. We hypothesize that by moving our customer testimonials higher on the page, we'll increase our lead conversion by 5%, et cetera, et cetera. The one thing that I always try and remember when it comes to A/B tests and creating hypotheses is that we're human. I say that because we're marketers, we're looking at data logically. We're looking at data from the perspective of someone who hasn't been spending the last 2 days trying to figure out what phone they want to buy, or whether or not it's actually worth trying that new restaurant. We as humans tend to make decisions emotionally and then rationalize them logically. So it's really important to bring that human element and that persona element into your conversion rate optimization process as well, at least in my experience and the way that I've had success. In terms of behavioral psychologies, if you're curious, there's a really neat resource called Cogload, and if you search for Cogload gems, you'll get a lot of really interesting kind of one-pagers about some of the more common behavioral psychologies. And on the other side of it, I also start with the qualitative data. So I start with the user in order to not give myself a confirmation bias when I'm looking at data. So typically, this is the process that I work off of. Do some research and analysis, build a hypothesis, run the design, test and learn, and then rinse and repeat. Throughout all of it, bringing in people from different departments and not just relying on a designer or a UX person, but bringing in a bunch of different disciplines and a bunch of different stakeholders so that there is buy-in and that there is an open conversation about what the consumer is looking for as well. Now, one thing, whether or not we talked about this yesterday, if you have, I apologize, but one thing that actually took me a very long time to remember was that statistical significance does not mean there is a 99% chance of a 10% uplift. What it means is that there is a 99% chance that this did not happen by chance. So that it's something with that in mind, where if you run a test during a particularly busy season or when your customers have slightly different behaviors, it's worth revisiting that test later. It's always worth coming back to your tests and pressure testing them and making sure that it is something that sticks with different audiences, because this is very much kind of a moment in time metric. For a heuristic review, which is also a part of my general process in terms of the research, this is the framework that I use. It's called the LIFT framework. You look at your relevance, your clarity, any distractions and anxieties from that value proposition, and then also take a look to see where there is urgency, or if there is any urgency that is given on your page. So for example, what Amazon always does around, there's only 2 left in stock, better get yours now. You would want to take a look and see whether or not that's relevant for your business as well. And I'm very much an American kind of go big or go home kind of person. So generally I try and aim for a higher uplift than 5%. But my general rule of thumb and the way that I generally look at it is, if you're aiming for a lower minimum detectable effect than 5%, then you need to revisit your hypotheses. You need to revisit the kind of impact that you think that is going to have on your audience, and whether or not a 5% uplift is worth it. That's my 2 cents. Everyone has their own different opinions. But I typically, at a minimum, would aim for a 5% change. In terms of how long I should run my tests, I usually look at 2 different sources. So my platform, like Google Optimize or Google Optimizely, Google Optimize or Optimizely, tongue twister there. But I also take a look at this calculator, which is from VWO. I don't know if any of you would use Visual Website Optimizer. It's a more kind of entry-level, but relatively inexpensive. So if you're looking to get started, it's worth it. But they have a calculator that will actually tell you how long you should run your test, purely based on the traffic to the page, the current conversion rate, and how much uplift you're expecting. So some platforms will say, we've got a result at 2 weeks. Sometimes this calculator will say, you need 4 weeks or you need 5 weeks. Generally, I defer to the longer time period. Again, that's my working process, but it's borne out a lot of experience, because you do have a wider group of people, and that can change your results. I also, in terms of how I run a test, I'll do a canary test, like a canary in a coal mine, to make sure that there are no technical implementation errors. I'll run 90% the original and then 10% the test for 24 hours to make sure that things are running smoothly, then switch it on. I do everything that I can to not actually corrupt the data and make sure that things are actually going the way that they should. And those are really kind of the 2 things that I focus on, is making sure that Google is understanding that it is a test variant if it's a separate page, and then making sure that the data doesn't get corrupted. All right. And then something, especially if you're trying to build a culture of testing and a culture of data, you really want to make sure that you document and you share your results. And question for all of you, if you've checked your A/B test for SEO impact. It's not necessarily something that is common. It's a relatively new field, even in the States. So, for example, this was an example from a consulting company in the United States called Distilled. They had a 0 impact of 120% increase in their conversion rate or their revenue. And conversion rate optimization teams, if it was just looking at that metric, would have rolled it out. But the SEO impact meant that their visibility dropped, and it actually decreased their revenue by 78%, actually having a negative revenue impact. So it's always important, if you make any major changes to a page, to try and take into consideration what the impact on your overall visibility will be as well. In terms of how you actually want to do that, again, as this is a relatively new field, it's relatively limited in terms of the options. But Distilled, this consulting company, they actually have a platform called Distilled ODN that basically would be a replacement for your testing platform. So your Optimize, your Optimizely, your VWO, whatever your A/B Tasty, whatever you may use, and it would do SEO and CRO simultaneously. But if that's not something that you have the budget for or the technological capability for, they do also have a free modeling tool that will allow you to see what the forecasted traffic should be for your variant page to make sure that things are where they should be from an organic visibility perspective. Yep. And I am a massive data nerd, and that's because for me, the right data actually will inform your website and channel performance and can really show behaviors that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise. And it just, when that happens and when I find something out, it makes me smile, right? I'm a nerd. These are basic pleasures for us. But a little bit about me. I've been in digital marketing for 10 years, about 8 years in analytics, 5 years in conversion rate optimization and UX. I've also visited over 40 countries and lived in 3, and that's me in Mongolia, on a camel that seemed quite aggravated at the photographer. And I am absolutely happy to field any questions or anything that you may want to pick my brain on. But did anyone have any questions now? Anything that I could answer for you? Have a few minutes, maybe? No? Easy enough. Well, I will always be here to answer questions regardless, and thank you guys for your time.
SEO specialist from Optus, Amanda King. Another round of applause, please. Thank you, Amanda.